Can you talk about the state of America in 2003?
I'll say, Amy, it's been a very bad year. And I want to actually go over 3 things that have happened this year that I think a lot of Americans actually don't know about, but that have fundamentally changed the way that this country operates and will operate. The first thing is a Supreme Court decision. Back in January of this year, the Supreme Court heard a case called Moore versus Kim, and that case argued over the constitutionality of mandatory detention. Mandatory detention is a law under which the government has a right to incarcerate non-citizens, immigrants, solely because they are not citizens of this country and they fall within a very broad legal category. A lot of federal courts had overruled it, said it's unconstitutional. You can't hold people indefinitely, mandatorily, just because they are not citizens of this country. The Supreme Court decided to hear the case out, and in April they actually ruled to uphold the constitutionality of mandatory detention. So it was the first time since Japanese internment that the court actually upheld that blanket incarceration is in fact okay by our sort of basic legal standards. So a huge reversal of norms. Because of this decision, we're seeing an explosion in the incarcerated population of the U.S. Already we're at 2 million. Immigrants are the fastest growing segment of the domestic prison population. And right now there's no reason to believe that there's any reversal in that. I think that immigrants are going to continue to grow in the prison population, really feed the prison industry, both private prisons and county jails around the country that are really looking to inmates for money. Another thing that happened this year was special registration. Special registration was a program under which the Department of Justice required men and boys 16 or older from 25 predominantly Muslim countries to come to the federal plazas close to them if they were not citizens or green card holders and register themselves, provide personal information, biographical information, credit card information. Thousands and thousands of men went, over 80,000 went, over 13,000 were placed into deportation proceedings and are currently kicked out of the country already or now just starting their trials in immigration court. The Justice Department, or the Department of Homeland Security, recently announced a suspension of the special registration program. And that seems like it should be a victory. It's great, you know, finally men and boys from these countries and other countries aren't going to have to go and humiliate themselves under this process. But along with the so-called suspension, what we're actually seeing is a complete change of how the U.S. is treating its border. It's now requiring an exit-entry requirement for people from a variety of countries all over the world, and it's also discretionary. So basically, the way that the border sort of used to work is you come in, you have your visa, you give your information, you go, you know, you live your life in the U.S., you spend your time here, this is a nation of immigrants, right? Now what's happening is a much more sort of policing regime where people have to go to the airport, check in, provide information about where they're staying, what they're doing, and be on call to be called into the federal plaza again and give information about themselves. So it's really the way that we're, I guess, surveilling immigrants that are coming to the U.S. is really changing and really heightening. The last thing I want to point out is a real change in enforcement practices around the country. Since September 11th, we've really heard about an explosion in detentions and deportations and the policing of Arabs, Muslims, and South Asians. And I think that people don't really realize how expansive enforcement has become and how many different people, especially people from communities of color, are being targeted. Recently, there was a lawsuit filed against Attorney General Ashcroft. He seems to be popular for lawsuits these days, and he really should be sued for a lot of things. But Attorney General Ashcroft announced that the Department of Justice was going to start putting the names of immigrants into the National Crime Information Center database, NCIC. That database was created back in the 1940s or 50s in order to track people that had outstanding warrants in one state if they had gone to another state. Now immigrants' information is going to be put in that database, and basically now in New York, the sort of haven, bastion of immigrants, so many people from this country weren't born here, or from New York weren't born here. Now when police stop you on the street, and they can go to their database, the NCIC database, and look up whether or not you're an immigrant, whether or not you have any immigration problems, and effectively enforce immigration laws, even though that's not supposed to be their mandate. I put all of that out there because I think that in 2003, what we've been seeing through the growth in the incarceration of immigrants and the loss of the rights to not be incarcerated, the growth in special requirements for people who are not citizens of this country, you have to go register yourself here, you have to go do this, you have to go do that. And then now the increasing powers of the government or the local police to enforce immigration laws. I'm really concerned that in 2003 what we've seen is the deepening divide between citizens and non-citizens. Legal, social, and economic divides are deepening. And 50 years from now, I wonder, are we going to look back at this year as the beginning of an apartheid against non-citizens in this country or not?
Aarti, Shahani, I want to thank you for being with us, and we will continue to look ahead with you and monitor what is taking place in this country. Aarti Shahani is organizer for Families for Freedom, a longtime immigrants' rights activist. And again, her contact information, Families for Freedom, will be at our website at democracynow.org as we continue to reflect on this past year. Now with Michael Parenti, who joins us from the West Coast, as we started with John Pilger, who was already in 2004. Michael Parenti, his latest book is The Assassination of Julius Caesar, A People's History of Ancient Rome. His other books include The Terrorism Trap, To Kill a Nation and Democracy for the Few. The Assassination of Julius Caesar has been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Michael.
Hello, Amy.
It's good to have you with us. Well, John Pilger was just going to sleep in 2004. You are just waking up in California. Thank you for doing that for Democracy Now! Your brief thoughts today as we end this year.
I do think there was one remarkable thing that happened in the year 2003, and that is people all over the world in February mobilized and asserted their democratic sovereignty against the rulers of the planet. They marched in these massive demonstrations of unprecedented numbers in a scope unprecedented, from Japan to Lithuania to Poland to Finland to Spain to Mexico to Canada to Indonesia. All over the world, literally millions upon millions of people demonstrated against the U.S. action in Iraq before the war ever took place. And there were many of these countries that had no cultural or historic link to Iraq. They were demonstrating both out of regard for the Iraqi people, but also out of regard for themselves. They were serving notice, namely that U.S. leaders cannot presume to be rulers of the planet, to attack any country at will in acts of criminal aggression, to decide, to take it upon themselves to decide who shall live and who shall die, and to be in effect, the autocratic monarchs of the planet. People were fighting for their own national sovereignty and their own democratic sovereignty, for their own right to exist and be left alone in peace. And that war of imperial aggression has turned sour and gone a bit wrong for the United States right now. So I think there is some hope there that people are not totally taken in. Unfortunately, the one country where they are taken in is in the United States itself, in rather large numbers, where you have almost half of the people still supporting George Bush in that endeavor, which proves something I've said years ago, that the U.S. is maybe not the most brutally suppressed country in the world, but it is the most successfully suppressed. That suppression and rule is most effective when you're not using the police and such, but when you've got people co-opted and you've got them convinced that there's something out there threatening them, and that therefore they have to rally around the president and they have to surrender their rights, just as your previous speaker was talking about. There's nothing, the Constitution mentions nothing about citizens. The word doesn't appear in the Constitution, nor does immigrant and nor does alien. For due process and for equal protection of the laws, the only word that appears is persons. No person shall be denied due process. No person shall be denied equal protection. No person shall be denied habeas corpus. But it looks like the courts have ruled that person doesn't mean person. And again, violence to our language is done. One of the first steps done to distort things. No person shall be denied rights means no person. It means every man, woman, child, citizen, non-citizen, whatever else. But that's not the way they've come to read it, unfortunately. So we have these terrible trends, but we also have some hope here that people are awakening, and there were even huge demonstrations in the United States also. I never for a moment thought that those demonstrations would stop the U.S. from its criminal aggression, U.S. leaders from their criminal aggression. But what it did do is it did curb them. It did put a limit on how brutal they could be in Iraq. It did force them to talk about how they're really bringing democracy and a better life and prosperity to Iraq. So you have George Bush acting like a Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a New Dealer in Iraq. He wants to build schools, he wants to build roads, he wants to create jobs and housing and all that in Iraq, while he's acting like a William McKinley here in the U.S. And trying to strip and destroy whatever